Remember when every corner store had a wall of cigarettes behind the counter? When Export A green packs were everywhere? When your dad's brand said something about who he was? When smoking wasn't just a habit, it was part of Canadian culture? Want to go back to when cigarette brands were as Canadian as hockey and Tim Hortons? Before plain packaging, before graphic warnings, before smoking became socially unacceptable, Canada had its own cigarette brands, not just American imports, but distinctly Canadian smokes that were as much a part of our identity as the maple leaf itself. These weren't just tobacco products, they were cultural markers. Your dad smoked Players or Export A. Your uncle smoked du Maurier. Your grandfather might have smoked Sweet Caporal or Macdonald's. The brand you chose said something about who you were, your class, your region, your generation. From the 1950s through the 1990s, these brands dominated Canadian ashtrays, gas station counters, and vending machines. They sponsored hockey teams, racing cars, and concerts. Their logos were everywhere, on billboards, in magazines, on the boards at the Forum, and Maple Leaf Gardens. But one by one, they disappeared. Some were discontinued as smoking declined. Some were absorbed by larger tobacco companies and lost their Canadian identity. Some simply faded away as regulations tightened and the market changed. And with them went a whole culture of smoking that defined generations of Canadians. This isn't about glorifying smoking. We all know the health consequences now. But for those who lived through it, these brands represent a time when things were different. When you could smoke in restaurants, offices, and airplanes. When cigarette ads were on TV. When the corner store clerk knew your brand before you even asked. In this video, we're going to walk through the vanished cigarette brands that only true Canadians remember. The smokes that filled ashtrays from St. John's to Victoria. The brands that sponsored our sports and soundtracked our lives. Some of these names will hit you with instant nostalgia. Some you might have forgotten completely. And all of them will take you back to a time when smoking was just part of being Canadian. Before we light up these memories, hit that like button and subscribe. We've got a lot of brands to cover, and trust me, every single one is worth remembering. Let's go back to when Canadian cigarettes were Canadian. Brand 1, Export A, the green pack. Let's start with the most iconic, Export A. That distinctive green pack with the white maple leaf. If you grew up in Canada from the 60s through the 90s, you knew Export A. Manufactured by Macdonald Tobacco, later part of Imperial Tobacco, Export A was launched in the 1950s and became one of Canada's best-selling cigarettes. The green pack was everywhere. In shirt pockets, on dashboards, in ashtrays across the country. Export A had a reputation. They were strong, full flavor, high tar, not for beginners. These were a working man's cigarette. Factory workers, construction guys, truckers, Export A was their smoke. They weren't trying to be smooth or sophisticated. They were just strong, reliable Canadian cigarettes. The brand was heavily marketed. Export a sponsored racing, the Players Export a Racing rivalry, was legendary in Canadian motorsports. They sponsored concerts and events. The green pack with the maple leaf was a symbol of Canadian identity. There was also Export a Light in the gold pack, introduced when light cigarettes became popular in the 70s and 80s. But real Export A smokers stuck with the green pack. That was the original, the real deal. The brand started declining in the 90s as smoking rates dropped and regulations tightened. The distinctive green pack disappeared from stores, replaced by plain packaging. Export A still technically exists, but it's not the same. The brand that defined Canadian smoking for decades is essentially gone. For those who remember, Export A Green wasn't just a cigarette, it was a Canadian icon. That maple leaf on the pack meant something. It meant these were ours. Brand 2, Players, Navy Cut and Light. Players was the other giant of Canadian cigarettes, and the rivalry between Players and Export A defined Canadian smoking culture. Players' Navy Cut in the distinctive blue pack was the premium choice. Manufactured by Imperial Tobacco, Players had British roots but became thoroughly Canadian. The sailor logo, the blue and white packaging, it was instantly recognizable. Players' Navy Cut were smooth, refined, and slightly more expensive than Export A. They were the cigarette of choice for white-collar workers, professionals, and people who wanted something a bit more sophisticated than the working-class Export A. Players Light in the white and blue pack became hugely popular in the 70s and 80s when light cigarettes were marketed as healthier alternatives. They weren't healthier, we know that now, but millions of Canadians switched to Players Light thinking they were making a better choice. Players sponsored everything: hockey teams, racing, concerts, festivals. The Players logo was as common as the CBC logo. They were embedded in Canadian culture at every level. The brand also had Players Extra Light and Players Filter for those who wanted even lighter options. The Players family of brands covered every segment of the market. Like Export A, Players declined through the 90s and 2000s. The distinctive packaging disappeared. The brand still exists, but has lost its cultural significance. The Players that defined Canadian smoking for generations is essentially a memory. For those who smoked them or knew people who did, Players represented a certain class, a certain sophistication. They were the cigarette you graduated to when you wanted something better than the cheap smokes. Brand 3. Du Maurier, the sophisticated choice. Du Maurier was the cigarette for people who thought they were too sophisticated for Players or Export A. Manufactured by Imperial Tobacco, Du Maurier was positioned as a premium brand. The red pack, regular, and gold pack, light, had an elegance that other brands lacked. These weren't working-class cigarettes, these were for people with taste. Du Maurier had a reputation for smoothness. They were less harsh than Export A, more refined than Players. They were the cigarette of choice for professionals, executives, and people who wanted to project success. The brand was heavily advertised with sophisticated imagery, beautiful people, in elegant settings. The message was clear: Du Maurier smokers were a cut above. Whether that was true or just marketing, people believed it. Du Maurier also sponsored major cultural events. The Du Maurier Jazz Festival became one of Canada's premier music events. The Du Maurier Classic was a major women's golf tournament. The brand positioned itself as cultured and refined. There was also Du Maurier Special Mild and Du Maurier Ultralight for those who wanted lighter options. The brand covered the premium segment thoroughly. Du Maurier declined along with all cigarette brands as smoking rates dropped. The sponsorships ended when tobacco advertising was banned. The brand still exists, but has lost its premium positioning and cultural cachet. For those who smoked Du Maurier, it was a statement. You weren't just smoking, you were smoking something better. Whether that was true or just clever marketing, it worked for decades. Brand 4. Macdonald's, the budget choice. Macdonald's cigarettes were the budget option, and there was no shame in that for working people trying to save money. Manufactured by Macdonald Tobacco, the same company that made Export A, Macdonald's were cheaper than the premium brands. They came in various versions: Macdonald Special, Macdonald Export, but they were all positioned as affordable smokes. The quality was decent. They weren't harsh or terrible, they were just cheaper. For people on tight budgets, for students, for anyone watching their money, Macdonald's were a practical choice. The red and white pack was common in working-class communities. Factory workers, laborers, people working multiple jobs, they smoked Macdonald's because they couldn't afford Players or Du Maurier, and that was fine. There was no pretense with Macdonald's. They weren't marketed as sophisticated or premium. They were just affordable Canadian cigarettes that got the job done. The brand faded as the cigarette market consolidated and budget brands became less viable. By the 90s, Macdonald's were mostly gone from stores. For those who smoked them, McDonald's represented practical economics. You smoked what you could afford, and there was no judgment in that. Brand 5. Matinée, the women's cigarette. Matinée was explicitly marketed to women, and in the 60s and 70s, that was a thing. Manufactured by Imperial Tobacco, Matinée came in a distinctive pink and white pack. They were slim, elegant, and marketed with imagery of sophisticated women. The message was clear: these were cigarettes for ladies. The cigarettes themselves were milder and smoother than men's brands. They were designed to appeal to women who found regular cigarettes too harsh. Whether this was real or just marketing, Matinée carved out a niche. The advertising was relentlessly feminine, beautiful women in fashionable settings. The tagline emphasized elegance and sophistication. It was Mad Men-era gender marketing at its peak. Matinée was popular among women in the 60s and 70s, but the brand faded as gender-specific marketing became less acceptable and women increasingly smoked the same brands as men. By the 80s, Matinée was mostly gone. The idea of a women's cigarette seemed outdated, and the brand couldn't survive without its gendered marketing angle. For women who smoked Matinée, it represented a time when products were explicitly gendered, for better or worse. It was a product of its era. Brand 6. Sweet Caporal, the old-timers smoke. Sweet Caporal was an old brand that hung on into the 70s and 80s, mostly smoked by older men who'd been smoking them for decades. Manufactured by Imperial Tobacco, Sweet Caporal dated back to the late 1800s. By the 60s and 70s, they were considered old-fashioned, but they had a loyal following among older smokers. The cigarettes were unfiltered and strong. This was old-school smoking. No filters, no lights, just tobacco. Your grandfather might have smoked Sweet Caporal, and he wasn't switching to some newfangled filtered cigarette. The red pack was distinctive, and seeing someone smoke Sweet Caporal immediately told you something about their age and their resistance to change. These were cigarettes for men who'd been smoking since before filters were invented. The brand faded through the 80s as its customer base literally died off. Younger smokers weren't interested in unfiltered cigarettes, and Sweet Caporal couldn't adapt. By the 90s, Sweet Caporal was gone. The brand that had been around for nearly a century couldn't survive the changing market. For those who remember seeing older men smoke Sweet Caporal, it represented a connection to an earlier era of smoking, before health concerns, before filters, when cigarettes were just cigarettes. Brand 7. Craven A, the smooth alternative. Craven A was marketed as the smooth, throat-friendly cigarette, and for decades that positioning worked. Manufactured by Carreras, later absorbed into larger companies, Craven A had the slogan, "Will not affect your throat." This was before health warnings, when cigarette companies could make health claims, however dubious. The black and red pack was distinctive. Craven A positioned itself as a premium alternative to Players and Du Maurier. They were smooth, refined, and supposedly easier on your throat. The brand had a loyal following among smokers who found other cigarettes too harsh. Whether Craven A was actually smoother or it was just marketing, people believed it and remained loyal. Craven A sponsored various events and had a presence in Canadian culture, though never as dominant as Players or Export A. They were a solid second-tier brand with a specific niche. The brand faded through the 80s and 90s as the market consolidated. By the 2000s, Craven A was essentially gone from Canadian stores. For those who smoked them, Craven A represented a smoother smoking experience. Whether that was real or perceived, it was enough to build brand loyalty for decades. Brand 8. Peter Jackson, the mild choice. Peter Jackson was the mild cigarette for people who wanted to smoke but found regular cigarettes too strong. Manufactured by R.J.R. Macdonald, Peter Jackson came in a distinctive white and gold pack. They were marketed as mild and smooth, appealing to smokers who wanted less harshness. The brand was popular in the 70s and 80s, especially among newer smokers and people switching from stronger brands. They were positioned between regular cigarettes and ultralights. Peter Jackson had decent market share, but never achieved the dominance of Players or Export A. They were a solid mid-tier brand with a specific appeal. The brand faded through the 90s as the cigarette market declined overall. By the 2000s, Peter Jackson was mostly gone from Canadian stores. For those who smoked them, Peter Jackson represented a milder smoking experience without going all the way to ultralights. The smoke clears. Close your eyes one more time. It's 1975. Your dad pulls a green pack of Export A from his shirt pocket. He taps one out, lights it with his Zippo, and takes that first drag. The smoke curls up toward the ceiling, and nobody thinks twice about it because that's just what people did. These vanished cigarette brands, Export A, Players du Maurier, Macdonald's, Matinée, Sweet Caporal, Craven A. Peter Jackson, they weren't just tobacco products. They were cultural markers that defined generations of Canadians. They're gone now, victims of declining smoking rates, tightening regulations, and changing social attitudes. And that's probably for the best we know now, what smoking does to health, to families, to society. But for those who lived through it, these brands represent a time when things were different, when smoking was normal, accepted, even glamorous, when cigarette brands were part of Canadian identity, when the green Export A pack or the blue Players pack meant something. We're not glorifying smoking. We're remembering a time, a culture, a part of Canadian history that's now gone. These brands shaped our parents' and grandparents' lives, for better or worse. What brand did your dad smoke? Do you remember the distinctive packs, the smell, the ashtrays? Share your memories in the comments. If this video took you back, hit that like button and subscribe. Share it with someone who remembers when Canadian cigarettes were everywhere. Thanks for watching. And remember, the past isn't just nostalgia. It's history, even the parts we're not proud of.